Hello. Welcome everybody to our session, Introduction to Logic Models. So this is a condensed version of our training, Making Use of Logic Models. Our short webinars help busy policymakers think through local growth interventions. I'm Megan Streb. I'm Deputy Director of Outreach here at the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. I'll be joined later by my colleague Victoria Sutherland, who's Deputy Director of Evidence. So just to give you an overview of today's session, we're going to introduce logic models. We will provide some tips to help explain their usefulness to colleagues and help get them on board. We're also going to be talking through a bad example, and we will, of course, leave plenty of time for your questions. So please do add them to the Q&A throughout as you think of them. Now, I would, without any further ado, like to hand over to our Deputy Director of Evidence, Victoria.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. Megan, if you could move on to the next slide. So I'm going to start us off today by talking a little bit about what a logic model is and what the key steps within a logic model are. And then I'm going to hand back to Megan, who's going to talk a little bit broadly about how this might be useful to you in your work. I think a logic model is essentially a systematic way to look at an intervention. So whether that's a project or a program or a policy, regardless of what kind of level we're looking at. And one of the great kind of benefits of doing that is that you are you're building a picture of what you're doing, why you're doing it, what kinds of changes are you going to try to deliver, but that you're not just I think sometimes people look at the logic model and think, oh, okay, there's a bunch of boxes here, and what I need to do is fill in some stuff into each box and then I'm done, okay? But actually what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a story about how you're going to deliver that change that your area needs, okay? So it's not just a bunch of boxes. What it is it's a graphical representation of the theory of change that underpins your intervention. So in terms of thinking about it, we would always argue that the place to start is with your kind of need and your context, okay? So what we mean by need is, what is the problem that you are trying to solve? Or alternatively, what is the opportunity that you're trying to take advantage of? You know, not everything is a problem. Sometimes there's something good that comes along and you want to kind of capitalize on it. I think when we think about the logic models we often see in local growth policy, the main challenge that you obviously often get with the need and the context is that people try to shove everything in the kitchen sink into that box. So we would argue that generally it's better to have a narrow definition of your need. So to focus on kind of one or small number of issues in there. The other blue box that you'll see in that top left-hand corner is about policy context. So what we mean by that is, what are the current policies or strategies or funds that are going to support you in addressing that need? So I don't know about people on the call, but I've been working in local growth policy for over 25 years now. And many of the problems that we face now are the same problems that we faced for that entire period. You know, so we have issues with unemployment, especially concentrated within certain groups. We often have problems in terms of business startup rates not being as high as we would like, or business growth rates not being as high as we like. We're often kind of struggling with infrastructure. So do we have the right infrastructure in order to enable growth? So the policy context is the bit that kind of tells you, what have you got at your disposal to address this issue in the current time, okay? So once you've set out your need and your context, what you can then do is identify your objective. So what is it that you're trying to achieve? What is it that you're trying to change with this intervention? Now, if your need and context has ended up being a bit broad, the objective is often the place where you will end up having to narrow it down. So, you may set out an unemployment rate as being a challenge for your area, but you're most probably not going to address unemployment as a whole with just one intervention. So maybe you're narrowing it down to a particular group or a particular barrier to employment that you're going to lift. So objectives are about setting out what is the change that you're trying to deliver. We then go to the impacts and outcomes and outputs, okay? So the impacts and the outcomes are how we describe the change that we are hoping to deliver, okay? Now, trying to figure out what's an impact and what's an outcome is a little bit of an art rather than a science. There are no hard and fast rules. But we would tend to say that an impact is longer term and higher level, whereas outcomes are about what can we achieve in the medium term. Okay, so as an example, if you had a program that was working with the unemployed, the outcome would be that they have moved into work or they have sustained work, whereas the impact would tend to be either something like the impact on the employment rate for the area as a whole, or it might be about longer term, what do the careers of those people who went through the program look like over the long term. One of the challenges with impacts is that because they are longer term, we often aren't able to kind of build in the right mechanisms to be able to measure that. We're often very constrained by, particular funding envelopes, and that might be something that, is 10 years away. But also sometimes we really have challenges in terms of attributing the contribution of our intervention to that impact. And we're going to look at an example in a minute where I think that will become a little bit clearer. Okay, whereas outcomes, because they tend to be kind of medium term and they're a lot more connected to the intervention, it's often easier to be able to capture the data and to understand the impact that we've had. Outputs are the final category in this kind of that I'd like to talk about. So outputs are the things that will be the direct result of the activities. Okay, so if I go back to our example of a program to support the unemployed back into work, let's assume that that's a program that has provided some training that's led to a qualification in an area where we know employers have demand for workers, but they need kind of the qualification to be able to start work. So perhaps care would be a good example there. The completing the training and getting the qualification are the outputs. Okay, so these are things that we tend to measure through monitoring systems or management information systems. But the reality is, we don't generally actually care that much about whether people have completed the training or got the qualification. What we actually really care about, the change we're interested in, is that they've managed to get into work and sustain work. And I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about the difference between the outputs and the outcomes. The outcomes are the change that we're trying to see. The outputs are the deliverables that are going to take us on the route towards that change. And then finally, on the left-hand side, we've got our inputs and our activities. So the inputs are the resources that will be used, and the activities are the things that are going to be delivered. So in the example I've used throughout, that's a training program, perhaps a little bit of work experience, a little bit of careers coaching as well. I think that's probably all I want to say here. Megan, could we click onto the example? So what we've got an example here. So we've got a scenario where there's actually a number of different issues within the area that we're looking at that kind of have come together So we've got individuals who are in poor health because of inactivity. So what we mean by that is physical inactivity as opposed to economic inactivity. We know that the area also struggles with congestion and poor air quality, and no doubt connected to the congestion. So what we've got is we've got a range of different issues that are facing our area. And we also know that we're assuming that this is a city, so the City Council has made a net zero commitment. Okay, so what we've got is we've got a policy which is about increasing cycling and walking by local residents within 1 kilometre of some new cycle paths and footpaths. Okay, so if we're being realistic about this, increased cycling and walking is not going to be enough to address all of the issues due to poor health, all of the issues in relation to congestion, and all of the issues in relation to poor air quality, but it will make a contribution to each of them. So that's what I kind of mean when I'm saying what we want to do is kind of narrow it down, okay? Even if our need and context is a bit broad and woolly, in our objectives, we should narrow it down. So taking those objectives and pulling them across into the outcomes and the impacts, what we're saying is that the long-term impact is improved health, reduction in congestion, improved air quality. Okay, so what we can see there is that feeds directly back into the need. Okay, so if this program does what we think it's going to do, it should play a role in addressing the issues that we have identified in the need and the context. However, as I said earlier, sometimes it's going to be difficult to fully attribute that impact. So lots of things affect the health of residents, and whilst cycling and walking is going to help, it's going to be cycling and walking consistently over a long period of time, and there'll be other things going on in those people's lives that are also impacting their health. So kind of harder to attribute. Once we get into the outcomes, however, it's going to be much easier to be able to see some of these outcomes. So we're saying that we want to see a 20% increase in walking and cycling to school, that's within kind of 750 metres of routes. And we're saying a 10% reduction in congestion on adjacent roads in peak times. I think something to really fix on here is these are really quite specific. Okay, so we've talked about the scale of the change, so 20% increase, 10% reduction, but we're also setting other parameters, so within 750 metres of the cycle routes, on adjacent roads at peak times. We've put a real level of kind of specificity in here. But this is essentially the change that we want to see. We want to see more walking and cycling, and we want to see less congestion. Okay, working backwards, our outputs are cycle paths and footpaths that are completed. And because one of our activities is going to be marketing campaign to promote cycling and walking, we've also got an output there about flyers into homes. So during our final two boxes, our activities are around building those cycle paths and footpaths and running our marketing campaign. And then we've also got inputs in terms of budget and staff time. So I think that's an important point actually about inputs, is that we tend to think mainly about the budget, but there might well be other inputs that come to bear. Okay, so that might be staff time internally, it might be partners, it might be in-kind contributions, so for example, if it's a business support program and your local chamber does a whole bunch of stuff to help ensure there are referral routes in, that's also an input that you might want to be thinking about. So once you've got it all plotted out like this, the thing to do is to start testing the links between the different stages. So does the evidence tell us that those activities are likely to lead to those outputs? What does the evidence tell us about whether those outputs are likely to lead to those outcomes, and so on and so forth? And within that, you want to use as much evidence as possible. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Megan for the next few slides.
Thank you. So just a reminder that as questions come up, please do put them in the Q&A, and we will come to them at the end. You may have some more questions after this next session, where we are going to be thinking through outputs, outcomes, or impact. So a very quick matching exercise. So we're going to ask you to jot this down on a piece of paper, or you can think through it through in your head. You can write it down somewhere else. Don't feel that you have to put this in the Q&A. That is totally fine. This is just for your own benefit. So we are going to think through two different needs, and we are going to go through the first one, go through the second one, and then I want you to think about, well, what's the appropriate output, outcome, and impact for these? So the first one, high-skilled businesses have moved into the area, but resident skills lag, right? So now, obviously, if this is the need, we're going to want a lot more evidence before we really understand what's going on there, but let's take that as read. And the second one is business startups in the area have a poor survival rate. So what I'd like you to do is just take a minute in your own time and kind of think through what would be the appropriate outputs, outcome, and impact. And this is where, when people are watching this again, hopefully on YouTube, this is a chance for you to do the same, to pause, to kind of maybe have more of a think about it. And we will go through the answers in just a minute. Silence is probably terrible for YouTube algorithm, but that's fine. This is much more for kind of just helping you think through the learning. So we will give you a minute. Okay. Some of you are likely still reading through this, but just in the interest of time, we're going to go through the answers, and hopefully, as we're going through them, you'll think, "That's it," that's exactly what I thought, or or, "Oh, okay, I see how that's a bit different." Right. So for number one, high-skilled businesses have moved into the area, but resident skills lag. So the output is going to be that thing that we are delivering, right? Is the direct result of our activities. And so in this instance, it is D, that 50 new sessions. We delivered 50 sessions to promote degree apprentices with businesses, and we worked with universities to establish 2 new uni courses, right? Now the outcome, that change that we want to see, is going to be F. So that is less within our control, right? It's still quantifiable, still something specific that we can measure, but it is far less in our control to make sure that it happens. So we have that 55 new degree apprenticeships have been completed, right? Because maybe we run the sessions with prospective apprentices, we run sessions with businesses, but that doesn't mean we can actually make them sign up, complete the course, go through the whole process, right? And actually get to that completion stage. And in the similar way, we end up, the change we want to see is 40% more students on high skill courses, right? And we can help to set up the course, we can run all sorts of engagement activities, but we can't make people actually sign up, right? But that is the change we're aiming to see. And that long-term thing that we're aiming for, even if we can't, even if it's hard to attribute this particular thing of one of the many things that are looking to address this, is see that there are fewer skills gaps reported. Okay, so similar kind of approach for the second one, business startups in the area, which have a poor survival rate. So we have B, that there are 20 mentoring partnerships with businesses and 50 action plans with new businesses, right? So again, this is the direct result of the activities that we're running. We can put people in touch with each other. We can help deliver action plans. And then the change we want to see is E, that 80% of new businesses complete the actions within their action plan, right? We can write the action plan for them. Whether or not they do the thing might not be in our control. And similarly, 65% still in business after 1 year, right? That's the change we want to see, that survival rate has increased. But how much control we have over that is going to be difficult. And then again, that long-term thing that we're looking for, that long-term change is A, the area business survival rate has improved, okay? So now I'm going to give a sales pitch on logic models and why they matter. Now, what I'm assuming is that if you've signed up for this training, there is a good chance that you already know a little bit about logic models, or you already are pretty sure that they are going to be important for how you're thinking about projects, how you're thinking about policy, how you refine your outcomes and get really clear. So this is much more a sales pitch for you to take to colleagues, right? How do you get them bought in to using this as a tool within your own day-to-day, right? Because it can be hard to try to do this on your own. And certainly, as we've said, collaboration is an important part of this. So how do we make sure that your colleagues are going to come along with you using logic models more consistently? So as you're putting together a project, right, you need to know where you're at, where you want to get to, and how you're going to get there, right? And you need to also be able to communicate that to others, whether that's colleagues managing the delivery or who are writing the bid, whether that's someone who is holding the purse strings, whether that's internal or an external funder, as well as partnering organizations, right? And this cartoon here, where we see something really clear at the start, something pretty clear at the end, and then in between it just says, then a miracle occurs, right? That is not a good strategic case. And often that's how projects can feel, right? Sometimes when we're designing projects or when we're talking or writing about it, it feels like a bit of a black box, right? We're clear about our budget and resourcing, which are the inputs. We're clear maybe about what targets have been set, but actually linking that all up feels a bit unknown, right? And logic models is a great way to get that clarity. So it is a process, as Victoria said at the start, it is a process that helps you tease that out and really test the logic between those steps, get that clarity so it doesn't feel like a bit of an unknown. So it lets you think through systematically whether the inputs and the activities are going to help you achieve the outcomes and impacts that you want to see, and in turn address the initial need that you'd identified, right? So having that clear approach helps you summarize the strategic fit of your project and the strategic fit of those individual activities within both the need and that change you want to see. That helps you frame the narrative of how you're going to talk about your project, right? How you'll write about your project, how you're going to sell your project. That in turn can give confidence to stakeholders and funders, right? They then can clearly see why that budget is necessary, right? Why we need them to get involved as partners, why we need those particular activities, because it's really clear how they sit within that wider framing. And it also provides that framework for monitoring and evaluation, right? How do we know when we've actually achieved success? So Stephen Covey has a really good quote. If the ladder's not leaning against the right wall, every step we take just gets us to the wrong place faster. And I've definitely had experiences when I've done delivery. I knew I was doing good work. I also was pretty sure that I was not going to achieve those initial targets that were set for me. And I wasn't totally convinced that maybe I was doing what was originally intended, even though I knew that I was doing good work, right? And I was seeing good outcomes. And so a logic model is not just something that helps you think through and sense check whether or not your project is going to address that local need, whether or not you're going to progress towards strategic outcomes, but also helps you kind of think through as you're going, is that still true, right? So again, thinking of it as a process, is it still reaching that need? Is it still going towards those outcomes that we were originally thinking about? So again, a logic model is going to help you. Are you leaning against the right wall, right? So are you really clear about what that change is that you want to see? And do you have the right steps in your ladder in order to get you there, right? Are the inputs, activities, and outputs actually going to get you there and over that wall? So, and just in terms of that, thinking about really focused on the outcomes and the need, and making sure you keep coming back to that. I think it can help throughout. Again, not just in delivery, not just in the designing phase, but also in the delivery phase. So, have you got the right partners at early doors in order to reach the people that you want to reach or to have the impact that you want to have? Are you aiming your activities at participants to best address the need or to really see the difference that you want to see? Have you selected the right activities and also removed the ones that aren't a good fit to deliver the outputs and achieve the outcomes? And how will you know, right? What are the indicators that are going to show that you're achieving those outcomes? So, I think it also can really help us tell a narrative, right? It gives you the structure which you can then hang your story on. So I think it's often useful when you're thinking about telling that narrative, right? You want to think about your audience. And whether that's writing a strategic case for a funder, a briefing for an elected member, or a potential partnering organization, you want to make sure that you're able to think about, well, how do they understand the need, right? What's the change they want to see? How is what we're delivering going to help them with that? And I think it can often be useful to think in terms of 3 acts. So the first act is setting the scene, right? Who's in the story? Who is my cast of characters, both in terms of the beneficiaries, but also in terms of the inputs, right? The staff and partners who are going to be involved in it. And what is the problem that needs solving, right? Why do we need to intervene in this? Now, the second act is then what you're going to do about it, right? How are you going to solve this problem? So the activities and the outputs that are related to that. And then the third act is they all lived happily ever after, right? How will we know? What does happily ever after look like? How can we measure that? How can we know what success looks like? How will you know when you've achieved it, right? So being really clear about those outcomes and those impacts. Now, I've given you a whole bunch of different ways to talk about logic models with your colleagues, right? Thinking about a ladder, thinking about a black box, thinking about storytelling in 3 acts. Hopefully one of those sticks. Now, we also have a guide to using logic models, which we will make sure that we link to at the end. That can be also really useful just in general to kind of walk you through logic models, but right at the end, there is another analogy that might be useful. which is on baking a cake, right? So again, if you've got colleagues who are really unsure about the difference between outputs and outcomes, that's another analogy that can be useful just to help get people on board. Okay, so now we are going to sense check through a pretty terrible example. I know it says a bad example. It is a pretty terrible example. I'm going to make sure this is super clear. This is purposefully bad, but I would also say at first glance, this will look similar to projects that you've come across before, right? And I think this helps because at first glance, it can look okay. This helps show why logic models can be really useful. So I'm going to introduce the project and the logic model, and then Victoria is going to helpfully join and tear it to shreds is maybe a bit harsh, but she is going to point out some of the issues about it. So let us talk through what this looks like. So we've got need, and the context is that local high streets have a really high vacancy rate. Now, we also in our area have a large proportion of jobs are in retail and hospitality. Now, people are avoiding shopping on the high street because it's unattractive. Okay, so that's our need. We have a visitor plan, which the priorities include improving footfall on high streets, and we do have some local regeneration fund money that we can use. So that long-term change we want to see is lower vacancy rate on our local high streets, and we also want a higher employment rate in the area. And that medium-term change is a 25% increase in footfall after 2 years and 50 new jobs created. So this particular project, in terms of those objectives, are that we want to increase footfall and employment of 3 local high streets in 2 years. So how we're going to do that, we have 1.2 million in capital funding to be split across those 3 high streets. The activities we're going to do is we're going to install new benches and planters, we're going to improve the pavements, and we're also going to offer grants for businesses to improve their shop front. And then the outputs, so what we're going to deliver from those activities is we will have across those 3 high streets, 21 new benches, 9 new planters, 30 street trees, and we're also going to have given out 30 grants for shopfront improvements. Right, so that's going to lead to that new footfall and the new jobs created. Victoria, what do you think of my logic model?
Thank you, Megan. So I think this is an interesting project. I think lots of people on the call will work for local authorities or combines or, in allied things where they have real worries about their high street. I think, Megan, if you maybe click onto the next slide. So again, I would start in the top left-hand corner with our need and our context. So there's 3 statements in here, and I would quite like to kind of disentangle them a little bit. So the thing I would always be starting with when someone presents me with a logic model is I would be asking a lot of questions about, okay, well, what is the evidence? So in this case, the first statement, so local high streets have high vacancy rates, right? That's a thing that either you already have evidence of, or it's relatively easy to build the evidence of that. Push comes to shove, if you don't have someone, you just send someone out to literally count the number of units and the number of them that are vacant. That's not a hard thing to establish whether or not that's the case or not. I think, however, if we jump to the third statement, which is people avoid shopping on the high street as it's unattractive, I think that tends to be our default assumption about why high streets are struggling, okay? Or at least it's one of our default assumptions. So if someone was presenting this project to me, I'd want to really understand whether or not we have good evidence that that's the reason that people aren't shopping on the high streets, because actually there's lots and lots of different reasons. I mean, I think there was a big kind of review of high streets, I don't know, maybe kind of 5 years ago or something. And my recollection is their list of reasons why high streets were struggling had like 30 or 40 different factors on it. So I'd really want to tie into that one. On the third one, so again, retail and hospitality is a large percentage of jobs in the area. There's lots of kind of national data sets that would tell you whether or not that is true. But I'd really want to interrogate that in a slightly different way. So number one, it might be true that retail and hospitality is a high percentage, but that doesn't actually tell you whether these three high streets are the reason that it's a high percentage. Perhaps those jobs are elsewhere. Perhaps they're in a large retail park, or there's nice residential areas that have clusters of hospitality businesses in them. Like, I would want to dig into that. But also, I'm not entirely convinced that just because you've got a high proportion of retail and hospitality jobs already, that's a reason why you would want to build on that. So in particular, we often talk about the difference between tradable and non-tradable sectors. Generally, what we want to do is we want to grow our tradable sectors because they're the ones that kind of drive productivity and competitiveness and kind of long-term prosperity. So I'm not 100% convinced by that kind of statement in the middle. So they're the first kind of chunk of things I would pick up on. If we could go to the next slide, Megan. So the next thing that I'd look at is kind of the objectives, the outputs, the outcomes, the impacts. A bit more difficult to do a box that accurately kind of captures them in the ping. I think whether or not these are right depends in part on the answer to those questions that I've posed about need and context. So in particular, there's in kind of the objectives, in the outcomes, and in the impacts. In each of them, we're talking about employment at some point. I've queried whether I think employment is really, the big issue. But even if that kind of, percentage isn't an issue, if you were going to try to improve footfall, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to increase turnover and in turn either increase wages or increase employment as a result of that. So I think there's a little bit of iteration. So there's always actually iteration. Each time you look at something on a logic model, you should then look at how it's kind of impacting on the different bits. The other thing that I would really challenge here is there seem to be some disconnects within these boxes. So in our outputs, we've got 21 new benches, 9 new planters, 30 street trees, 30 grants for shopfront improvements. And what we think this is going to do, at least in terms of outcomes, is increase footfall by 25% in a 2-year period and create 50 new jobs, okay? I feel like 50 new jobs is really quite ambitious for the scale of, we've got, so these are 3 high streets. So we're basically saying on average, 7 new benches, 3 new planters, 10 new trees, and 10 shop fronts that have been improved. That seems like a lot to feed through into a 25% increase in footfall and 50 new jobs created. So I would really be kind of challenging, like, what is our evidence? Like, do we have evaluation evidence? Do we have evidence from our project's kind of management information system that suggests that we would get that kind of scale of impact? And also remember, we're talking about 2 years here. So even if those improvements to the high street happened, did lead to an increase in footfall, that increase in footfall has got to feed through into people spending more money, not just coming and having a look, but actually spending more money. And the businesses would need to be confident enough that this was going to be a sustained improvement and not just a temporary blip in order to go on to hire people. So I think, footfall, maybe you can make a stronger case for, but I think the 50 new jobs is really quite a big stretch. And similarly, I would argue that once you get up to the impacts, even if we got those 50 new jobs, that's not going to feed through into a higher employment rate that you're going to see in something like the labour force survey or the annual population survey for your area. You know, that's a rounding error on a rounding error. So again, you know, that may be kind of why you're doing it, but you're not necessarily going to be able to see that. And then finally, Megan, if you could click on, if we look at the inputs and the activities, so we've got 1.2 million capital funding, and we know that what we're doing from Megan's description is installing the benches and planters, and offering kind of shop front improvements. It's much harder to criticise here, but I would use this as a way of really kind of thinking, does that budget and that set of activities, is that going to lead to those outputs, outcomes, and impacts? You know, so is £1.2 million enough to deliver those activities and outputs? Or in fact, you know, the opposite might be that, you know, you could get more investment out of 1.2 million. So, you know, I don't deliver town centres, so I don't know whether this is kind of an underestimate or an overestimate. But what you would want to be doing is looking at kind of programme management information from previous projects, either by yourself or others, in order to get a better sense of whether or not that's right. I think the other thing I would pick up on here is it's £1.2 million of capital funding. So what we've got here is we have got funding in order to enable these physical improvements to happen, but we don't seem to have any revenue funding either, you know, to maintain that stuff over the longer term, or indeed to do other activities that might encourage people to come back and try the new and improved high street. So I think that's also another thing. Think about whether the kinds of inputs that you've got actually are going to enable you to, you know, deliver what you're trying to achieve, or whether you need a different kind of budget. So again, once you've done that, you might, you know, it might be that you think you can increase your outputs a bit, or you need to take them down a bit, or that you need to change some of your activities. So always when you're looking, you're going to want to be iterating. And I think both me and Megan have probably touched on this already, but I just want to remake this point, which is that actually it's super useful to do your logic model collaboratively. So to have the different partners who are going to be involved in developing the logic model, because different people will have different insights and be able to spot, you know, in the sense checking exercise, different people will see different bits that don't quite stack up. So it's very useful to do it collaboratively. Okay, Megan.
Right. Thank you. That was all valid criticism of a very bad logic model. We're going to move on to questions. We've had quite a few come in. We don't have loads of time, but we're going to get through as many as we can. So I want to start. We've had two questions about the difference between objectives and outcomes. So I'll say how I see it. Victoria, feel you can then chip in if you feel any differently. I see objectives is often a more narrative way to tie in the outcomes that are specific for this project. That's the main difference for me, is it gives you a kind of pithy one or two lines that you can use when you're making your pitch to someone else. Victoria, I don't know if you have anything else.
No, I'd say that. So the objectives are the things that you're trying to achieve. So in local growth, that's, you know, the change that you're trying to see. And the outcomes are really just the measurable, you know, results that you have achieved that change. So yeah,
Yeah.
It's difficult. Like, I don't know. I think when you see it, it's obvious, but it's kind of difficult to describe it. But I would say it's like both are about the change. As Megan says, one's a little bit more narrative, and then the outcomes are more kind of like, you know, what is it that we will be able to measure that demonstrates that change?
I would also say that for any folks who've been working on UK SPF, you know, you don't really want to talk about your project as like addressing E21. right? Like that's not a great way to sell it to people when you're thinking about those standardized outcomes, right? So I think that having a space for that objective and to figure out actually how are we all going to come to agreement about, what we're trying to achieve through this allows you to kind of step away from those individual outcomes. We've had one, which I think is one, which is how you build on an effective evaluation strategy, which I want to make sure we cover. And then there's also a really interesting one about how we collaborate. So let's do this one first about building an effective evaluation strategy. I mean, this is a whole other training. But very quickly, Victoria, what would be your 1 minute explanation?
So I think the reason it's on the logic model is because we would argue that if you've got a really strong understanding of the theory of change that underpins your model, and that's the thing that you put into your underpins your intervention, sorry, which is what informs your logic model, it is much, much easier to develop a good, effective evaluation because you've got real clarity about what is the change that you're trying to deliver. So when we say evaluation, we're specifically interested in impact and value for money. There's obviously process evaluation as well. So I would say do your logic model because that will help you understand what your outcomes are and like what the link between those activities and outcomes are. And then building your evaluation is about figuring out how are we going to test whether or not we have actually delivered that change or not. But yes, we have lots of materials and lots of training that's specifically on evaluations.
Yeah. And also the Magenta book, I'm sure everyone's super excited to hear that government's Magenta book, which is a guide for evaluation, has just been refreshed. I'm sure it is the talk of everyone's office this week. So there's in addition to the materials that we have, there's also loads more materials that are also available more widely within government. Okay, so I want to ask this next question, and if you have others, please do ask them. Really happy to cover things. So this is, does the logic model encourage groupthink and stop out of the box innovation, which is fascinating because I think it does the opposite. And yeah, Victoria, I'm keen to hear what you think. So briefly, I would say I think if you use it as a collaborative tool and you allow people to really tease out assumptions, test the logic, have a really honest and frank discussion, I think it can lay bare what some issues might be and actually prevent groupthink. But Victoria, what do you think? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question. Thank you, Emma, for asking it. So I agree with you, Megan. That would be my prior. But I think the key bit is that you were saying if you're having an open and collaborative discussion about it, my suspicion is that if you are an organization or, a group of organizations that have come together around something where things are like, where dissent is not encouraged or, discussion is not encouraged, I can see how it might be a way of just reinforcing, people's assumptions, people's kind of prior positions. But if you are somewhere where you can genuinely do it in a collaborative and where you're willing to be kind of each other's critical friends, it should actually, make sure that like there isn't groupthink and that you are innovating. I think the challenge, one of the reasons, remember right at the very beginning, I said kind of the joy is like it allows you to look at something systematically. One of my kind of pet issues is that we often start with the activity. So in particular, we've got something that we've run for many years and we want to keep doing it. Often, the staff that are working on something are people that we've known for years and that, that we value in lots of different ways. We're sometimes actually stepping back and saying, okay, well, what actually is the need that we're trying to address? Let's think about each step, can allow you to get to something that actually really delivers the change rather than just being kind of business as usual.
Yes, that is, I think that's a really, really useful point. And sometimes it's something that I think we find a lot of the time in training, particularly if you have project managers who've come along who, are often like, we got to get this done, we got to get this written, we got to start delivery, right now. The focus is very much on jumping straight to the activities, right? They've already got a clear idea of what they've delivered before and how they're going to deliver it, how they can deliver it again, or how they can keep people in a job, right? I think being honest. So, but when you do have time to make time to kind of build in that questioning, to really stop and think, I think that it's very useful. And I think we deliver better projects as a result. Okay, we have a question about whether logic models and theory of change are the same, and how, or are there specific differences? So I have seen theories of change that look, in terms of a visualization, I've seen visualizations of theories of change that look completely different. I've seen cycles, I've seen overlapping circles, I've seen kind of systems map styles, because what people are trying to do is have a visual example of how change is happening, based on an intervention that's running and the broader context. So logic models I see as one way to visualize that theory of change. And I think it can also sit alongside a lot of other tools. It can sit alongside other ways to think about that theory of change. It can sit alongside a lot of the project management tools that people are using. I see it as a bit separate. Victoria, I don't know if you have anything else.
I think I mean, I think that's right. In part, one of the ways I think about this is I think about, and I think I've said this already, I think about the logic model as being a kind of graphic representation of the theory of change, by which I mean the theory of how the things that we're going to do are going to lead to the change that we need in response to that need. Okay. And when I was kind of querying the bad example, in part, I was kind of saying, well, what is the evidence of this? Right. And in particular, we're always really interested in the evidence of the links between the steps, that the activities will lead to the outputs, that the outputs will lead to the outcomes. And actually documenting that evidence, you're never going to do on something that looks like a logic model. So it's kind of like, remember Megan was saying that a logic model can be a good way of building consensus, of telling the story, of having a narrative. Whereas actually compiling that whole theory, you're often going to end up with quite a chunky document. So I kind of think of them as being like kind of different mechanisms for the same set of thinking that I think you should do to get a good intervention. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. We are almost out of time. So we had two comments about kind of thinking through some of the examples that we had. So one was about the time of activities being delivered, and I think that's also related to thinking about the time that's required sometimes to measure the change, right? And so one thing that we would always recommend is that this can also be a way for you to think through, the logic for some of that. So when we say thinking about your evaluation strategy, or how will you know what success looks like, thinking about time is a really important part of that. And then in terms of kind of being realistic about deliverability, how is that time reflecting on your inputs, right? If you decide that you want to measure change that's happened a year after delivery, then that's going to mean that's going to mean that someone has to stick around to do that. So, you have to have paid for someone to do that measurement or for that data to be available. So I think making sure that that's then reflected when you're thinking about your inputs, when you're thinking about your activities, all that's really important. We had then another comment about the footfall challenge, and what might be more useful things when we're thinking about the high street. And again, I think this is where really getting clear about the evidence for the need, both internally, what's happened before in your area, what are your colleagues saying about this kind of work, but also looking at the evaluation evidence more broadly, the research evidence more broadly. All of that is stuff that you can bring in. We will make sure that we include a link to other resources that we have that kind of talk through some of this as well, provide you to some other links. We will also make sure that we share links to our website. So that brings me to, just as we're wrapping up, some of the next steps. So a few more things that are useful from us just before we finish. So you will find lots more information about additional webinars, training. We have core concept guides on key economic concepts, our new data analysis guides. All of that you will find on our website, which is whatworksgrowth.org. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, it's on the QR code here, but it's also at the bottom of all of our web pages. And that is the best way to hear about future events and when new publications are published. This recording is already on our YouTube page because live stream is a wonderful thing. We'll also make sure that it is embedded on our website if you want to rewatch it or if you have colleagues who couldn't attend. We also, if you are within local government, if you're an officer within local government, so sorry, councillors, this is not for you, civil servants, consultants, you are not invited. But if you're a local government officer, we have a group on khub.net. We have a group called Local Economic Growth in the UK. We have over 100 officers in local government working, thinking about economic development. We are overdue some additional tidbits, thinking through data on productivity, on skills, soon to be investment to tie in with our upcoming webinars. So do join us there if that's useful to you. And otherwise, hopefully we will see you at another event soon. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.